Hi, everyone, and welcome to TrekPrime, Episode 3. I'm Andre, and this is Jeff.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, and this week we're going to be doing a very important episode to both of us, and it's especially close to my heart and my mind, thinking about Star Trek. And Jeff will tell you a little more about that, actually.
This week I wanted to talk about, the issue of whether or not Lieutenant Commander Data ever had a chance of becoming a sentient life form during the show, if there was ever a possibility of it.
Right. And Data was, right from the beginning of Star Trek The Next Generation, referred to by Commander Riker as Pinocchio, this artificial life form. He was an artificial life form whose creator, Dr. Noonien Soong, had imparted with the positronic brain, which was actually an idea formulated by another science fiction writer, the famous late Isaac Asimov. And the thing about Data was that, unlike his brother Lore, he didn't have emotions because Lore was very unstable and very cruel and actually resulted in the destruction of their home colony in Omicron Theta. So Data was built without the ability to perceive emotions or feel them. But he had a lifelong urge to understand emotions, to understand how they affected humanity. And, I don't want to go on too much about it, but when I was watching Star Trek The Next Generation, I was 7 when it started and about 14 when it ended. So it tracked along with me throughout my entire childhood. And I found myself relating to a lot of Data's experiences trying to understand humanity. Obviously, I wasn't a emotionless android, but I did understand the concept of people reacting in ways I didn't understand around me, and often being as befuddled as Data was, and how to deal with it. And I still do to this very day, as a matter of fact. Although, like Data, I've learned. Now, it always has interested me throughout Star Trek The Next Generation, throughout the movie, what series of events or technological developments could have resulted in Data achieving at least something close to him developing sentient life. I mean, he was qualified as alive, right? Starfleet qualified him as a living being.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I guess, in Measure of a Man, Picard had raised that issue, that even if he had consciousness in the slightest bit, I mean, does that make him a life form or anything like that? I mean, it was just, it was just trying to understand, just how close Data was to being an actual sentient being.
And there was a oh.
The reason why I had brought this up was because I remember when I watched Star Trek the motion picture, and they had, the probe, V'ger probe, and it sort of mirrored a little bit about Data, because here you have this probe that basically accumulated all the knowledge and logic of the universe, and yet it wasn't quite a life form yet. And it was trying to find its creator in order to see if it could become a life form. And it figured that the only way it could do that was to join with its creator. And I was thinking, well, maybe Data was kind of in that same conundrum through the whole series, where he was trying to get to the point where he needed to have this great big leap into, across a bridge, basically, from becoming just technology into becoming something biological, and that the combination of the two would have created a life form. It was just, I don't know, it was just a thought that crossed my mind. I was thinking, that's an interesting theory.
That's one of those fleeting thoughts that I may have had years ago, but maybe it was just a little too deep for me to deal with, because you just hit on something that might make Data, perhaps the very key centerpiece of all of Star Trek. Star Trek is supposed to represent the human condition. So you could almost say that Data is observing all of Star Trek, its history, its present, in a way, through his own eyes, because he seeks to be human and he's not. And, V'ger was the same thing. It was a machine, a very emotionless machine that had actually merged with another. And you could put that into the Changeling too. You know, Nomad was trying to find its creator, but not join with it. He was trying to understand who he was. But Voyager, V'ger was trying to merge with some sort of biological entity, a human, and its creator. But I don't know if V'ger thought its creator was a machine. I think maybe it did, but it wanted to join with that creator to understand more about who created it and who it was supposed to be. And now Data didn't have any great ambitions like that, but he wanted to understand humanity through sense memory and through his observations and learn. Now, a question I have for you, and some years ago in Star Trek Nemesis, of course, they killed off Data. And one of the reasons why, Brent Spiner was aging, and his physical appearance was starting to defy the grease paint, and they killed him off. And when that happened, my mother suggested an episode of The Next Generation called Inheritance. Data meets a woman who worked with Dr. Sung on him, claimed to be her wife. Her name was Juliana, I believe. And she gave Data more recitation on his life, and even kind of alluded to Nemesis with saying that there were prototypes, other android children before Lore, and we saw one of them in Nemesis with Before, assuming that's what that was. But the whole point is that he finds out through the episode, Data, that she is actually an android, and that she was created so that every part of her was designed to fool you into thinking it was human. And part of that was a chip that Dr. Sung installed, and Data watched it on the holodeck, and there was a program made just for him. And the program said that you're not to tell her she's an android. She'll shut down if she finds out. I designed her to terminate after a long life. Now, my mother, after seeing that, wondered, why couldn't they have a plot device where they found that information and discovered a way to bring Data to sentience by giving him the same thing that his mother had, that still being an android, but terminating after a normal human life, so he would have that experience, so he wouldn't outlive all of his friends.
But you're still at the same problem, I think, with that, is that even with the emotion chip and even with all the stuff, it's still technology.
It's not total sentience.
No, it's not. It's fake sentience. It's technology trying to mimic human emotion, trying to mimic how humans are. And as sophisticated as that is, I still don't think that even Data could have actually became a life form, even with that, is as advanced as his technology was. He was still separate from being a human. And Dr. Sung had, shown just how much he could get technology to that point, even when they showed his, his mother, I guess, or, his wife that he recreated.
Juliana.
He brought everything that he knew about his wife into the program of creating this robot, this android, and it was still, Data was still able to identify that she wasn't human because of the way she was blinking her eyes. He knew there was a program that was he recognized
little clues,
little things. So it's just, like I said, it's like what Roddenberry had wanted to do with the character. He wanted Data to get so close to being human, but not quite. That's the way he wanted it through the whole series. And when you mentioned Nemesis and what was going on in that, I think there was a hidden message in there that even the writers weren't aware of when they wrote the story. Because when I read some of the blogs and stuff about that, nobody ever really points this out. That Data sacrifice at the very end was more of a statement being said that Data finally understood that human life was always going to be more important than technology, and that humanity should never sacrifice itself for technology, that technology should always serve and sacrifice for humanity. And he finally understood that, and that's why he saved Picard, against his orders and stuff like that, and went over there and did that, what he did. So he understood in that regard, which was something he probably didn't know for all those years before that, but he finally realized that technology could never be more important than a human life. And that was really, that was so before,
So you're saying that in a way, Data had to discover the closest thing he had to humanity through his own destruction.
Yeah.
That was the medium by which he did it. And I was going to mention this because, I've looked up a lot of incidences about data becoming sentient in doing some research for this. Somebody on a forum I was reading, I can't recall the name of it now, said, some random forum, that they thought the closest data got to being biologically human was that time that the Borg Queen in First Contact sewed some sort of humanoid skin onto his face. But, sentience is not skin. It's not skin. That was more manipulation.
It was just connecting nerve fibers to,
right.
He's
still who he is.
Biology.
I mean, sentience is something that, we're only learning to understand ourselves. And I don't know if in the 24th century, if they have the full criterion for what sentience is. They know what they know. But, look at what Data faced with his daughter. She was designed to look human, kind of like that other one. And she was designed without emotions. But she started to surpass Data's ability, and that meant her destruction.
Yeah.
And through that, there was a scene where this admiral, who was indirectly responsible for this by pressuring her, Lal, to leave the ship, and he went in there and he said, Data's hands were working faster than I can keep up. Now, it could have been just him applying an emotional impulse to Data. But you have to wonder if his strong motivation for Lal to survive wasn't about the closest thing to a android emotion.
A program response, to try to stay ahead of the breakdowns. The faster he worked, the more responses, you know what I'm saying?
So you think it was just that admiral applying a human emotion to an algorithmic thing?
Yeah, because humans have a need, even with little small animals, we have a need to try to put human characteristics to small animals, like, oh, it knows what I'm thinking, or it's like, oh, did you see how he looked at me, or so, you know what I'm saying? We have a to do that with things we like, that, maybe the admiral felt so sad about what was going on. He felt something about himself, because his life apparently he had problems with his family, and he was bringing out his own inner history, I guess, with his family and how he couldn't relate to them, and saw and kind of transposed it on Data, and saw this battle between Data trying to save his daughter, and it just hit him emotionally.
Maybe it was to make us wonder, in a way. Maybe it was to make us wonder because, the idea was we heard certain things, but we didn't always know during Star Trek just how sophisticated Data systems were. Because, even though Lal's emotions were said to be part of a cascade failure or a malfunction, we don't know if that would have been the android equivalent of a person having a stroke or an aneurysm. Perhaps emotion is something that, if an android's programming is meant to go to a certain point, what happens when that programming starts to adapt and create new levels? When Data started dreaming later in the series, there was an alien influence, but there started to be creations of his own. And the Enterprise itself, I don't know if it was an alien influence, they never explained it too much, created its whole emergent life form. I don't know if that was something that an alien influence to get into the ship or what. It may not have been. The ship's circuitry might have been sophisticated enough where it developed neural nets of its own, and through holodecks and through different elements, it just created that. You have to wonder, if Data had kept on and kept adapting his programming, could the program have become adaptive, somewhat like the Borg, and through a similar adaptation, could have eventually developed into something like sentience, thought, and communication that wasn't just pre-programmed algorithms. Like beyond even an artificial life form, into something very different. I mean, that's one theory that they could have done had Data evolve in a very unusual way like that. Because emotion chips, like I said, that's programming. Like you said, that's programming. With the issue with Lal, that was just a stimuli response. And Dr. Pulaski, one thing I noticed about her, she was the doctor, for those who don't know The Next Generation well, in only season 2. People on a lot of Star Trek forums I know call her a bigot because she had trouble with Data being sentient. I don't think it was that at all. She was a scientist, and she was a doctor, and she acknowledged Data as an artificial life form, but she wanted to make sure that you know, it's like you said about a pet. She wanted to make sure that people realized that Data was unique and different, and not apply human things to a character on the ship that was simply not human.
Yeah.
And you know, and she didn't want people to delude themselves about it. And
Yeah.
I mean, even though, you know, I think even though she got close to Data over the years, I think Troy kind of hinted toward that too. You know, you have to remember who you are. You know, because Data might have sought out to be human, but you saw in his reactions, sometimes sadly, sometimes humorously, that Data's programming sometimes again made him more like a child among a lot of adults. You know, trying to understand the world around him, not fully aware of what emotions meant, and trying to emulate them and copy them, like his laughter. You know, he would laugh at a very, you know, the Data laugh. You know, because it was very. Brent Spiner was great at doing that because he had the comedic talent. But you know, this very Max Headroom-y kind of laugh because you know Data could only approximate the action, but it was just a reaction to something, but there was no feeling.
Yeah.
You know, he could not laugh spontaneously, and when he did laugh, it was something Q had done, and Q, obviously, since there's nothing he can do, could have made him sentient or human in a minute.
Yeah.
Could have done it very easily, but Data, you know, because Q obviously, even Data is sort of like a giant carpenter ant to him. He figured, well, that's their affairs to deal with, you know.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, Q could have theoretically done all that, but it wouldn't have been any challenge. So, and Q understood that. But like I said, you know, do you have any theories about a storyline that could have involved maybe alien interaction or a human scientist, perhaps, or Federation scientist that could have developed something that would have brought Data closer to sentient processes and sentient perceptions?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea?
Well,
Something that
I
could
think,
have been like that?
yeah, I mean, there could have been a story. I think, what was, I'm trying to think of that guy now, and that was trying to take Data away from the ship and Measure of Man. What was his name? Braddock or
Bruce Maddox, Dr. Bruce Maddox.
Yeah. Maddox, yeah.
Seen a lot of shows.
I was thinking that they could have done some kind of a follow up where he got closer to trying to design, a Soong type android, and with Data's help, they could have constructed the first non-Soong, you know what I'm saying, an android that wasn't created by Soong. They could have created something. Yeah. That would have been an interesting story, because I think it would have been a sort of like, they kind of hinted on it with Voyager a little bit, with the artificial, with the hologram, being sort of an artificial life form. And then they showed, I think it was like in the last season, and they just like, why did they drop this? They had like all these Type 1 holodeck, these emergency EMH programs working in a mine or something like that.
Yeah, that's what Guinan said would happen to Data if he was reproduced, disposable people.
So why couldn't we have seen like these group of all these EMHs coming up and sort of rising up against the people that are putting them there, and say, we can be more than just an EMH program or something like that. And I was thinking, this was almost like a link right to where Picard was making the argument. If we create a whole bunch of androids, wouldn't we be judged on how we treat that?
Right, because you're creating a race.
Yeah.
It's not just one android. You're creating a race, and won't we be judged by how we, like you said, deal with that race? And well, Picard said that, but you quoted it, of course.
Yeah.
But the thing is that yes, that's a very good point, and they could have gone. It would have been a great thing. On Voyager, they did have an episode where holograms came together and tried to seize a ship against the Hirogen, who were given that technology, and that was good. But I think that it would have been interesting to see all those EMHs, because the Doctor wrote that book. Photons Be Free or whatever, and it was re-edited at his request, similar to Measure of a Man. They were going to take his rights away from him because he was a hologram and they weren't going to do things. But apparently some of the leaked copies got to his brethren who were mining the lithium, and they were passing it around to each other. And you have to wonder, in some Star Trek future we didn't see, did they not petition the Federation Council, we can do more. We could be command or engineering holograms on your ships.
Yeah.
Just give us the chance. We're not just defective hardware. You could do a lot with us. You could build
or create a world like they were trying to do it, like we said with those renegade holograms, try to create
Right,
a world.
exactly. They could create a planet for them to live on and do their own adaptations.
That's right.
And, you know, because they're holograms, you know, it should only be a matter of the specific programming for them to be able to reproduce. So
Yeah.
it really, that could really have created a whole new kind of course, the planet would have had to have had one of the biggest hollow emitters you can imagine.
Or something simple where they would just have like little emitters all over the planet or something
Right.
like that.
You know, you would, I don't know. I mean, it would have had to have been a fiasco, but I'm sure they could have set something up. So that would have been an interesting thing to follow. But back to Data, you know, they didn't do that. But still, I'm wondering if you brought up Maddox, if he could, if they only mentioned him in Data's Day, one of my favorite episodes, because it kind of tracks Data's 24-hour period and looking at everything. You see it through his eyes, and it's cute. But the thing is with that episode was that Bruce Maddox was mentioned as an off-screen presence there. You know,
he's like writing a letter.
He's right, and you know, you have to wonder why in season 6 or 7, if they didn't have this thing where he met up with Data and said, "Well, I have some research, and I want to use a prototype and maybe a holographic android or something to work on perhaps making you have some sentient thought where you could learn to develop emotions naturally or something like that, where Data could go through an evolutionary step."
Yeah.
You know, because you know he was already nearly there as an artificial life form. They didn't call him a robot. They called him an artificial life form, a very sophisticated android.
Yeah.
And he was open to programming. I was watching one today called Masks, where Data surpassed the human experience, where this probe scanned the Enterprise and influenced its systems, and he developed the personalities of an entire race who had emotions like fear and arrogance and love, and they were children and women and all these different people, and he experienced that. And Picard said, "You have an experience that transcended humanity." So if Data could do that physically, could you imagine what Bruce Maddox could have done with the proper research? You know, if Data had that capability of being this vessel for emotional beings in their consciousness, I don't think he was incapable of experiencing sentience. I think it was a matter of setting him up for that process.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you look at Star Trek The Next Generation, you can see opportunities that were slighted on and even missed, where Data could have very easily gone that way, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that was something I wish they would have, you know, explored probably in the movies or something like that.
Yeah,
that they did. But they always went, you know, like with something you wouldn't expect, you know, or, you know, in the movies or something, you know. You know, it would have been neat to have Brent Spinner bring his character Data into Voyager instead of Barclay, you know, where, you know.
Have Data be behind Pathfinder, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, sort of, you know, I mean, not to be separate from the Enterprise, but, you know, have Data and Troy, you know, and maybe Barclay in there, to, you know, the three of them, because then it would have Data, and we could have had Data interact with the MH, and maybe we could have seen.
I like that idea.
Could have seen some kind of like a repartee where, you know, they were just analyzing each other to see how they could, you know, become human or life form or something, you know.
You know, I hate to play armchair scriptwriter here, but you just hit on a good point. What if instead of doing Nemesis, you know, and killing off Data in some other incidents, what if they had a Star Trek movie where Admiral Janeway, coming back from the Alpha Quadrant, was concerned about the other EMH Mark 1, and she assigned Data on a field command, being kind of close to them in a lot of ways, you know, to deal with the EMH situation, but he ends up becoming somewhat personally involved in their plight, and Data kind of leads them into understanding their own humanity the way he had done. And, you know, maybe Data dies in that struggle, but really putting the Data angle on and bringing those EMH into it, like having Data lead them toward this revolt or whatever you talk about.
Here's an idea. Yeah, he dies, but he downloaded a copy of himself and became an EMH himself, or like a hologram himself.
Something like that, like a hologram. I mean, but still, I mean, that would be an interesting theory. I mean, as it is, they kind of toyed with that before, but that all seemed like they were maybe copying Star Trek 3 a little bit. Like, this was just Data's Katra.
Wanted to leave a sliver of hope that Data would come back. You know, I don't think they just wanted to get rid of the character because he was so loved by the fans that they wanted to give the possibility out there that, you know, hey, Data exists inside this android, and eventually his program will override B4's programming, and then he'll just come back.
Here's another question. You mentioned this is a piece of technology, the emotion chip. They toyed with that in the next generation. They installed it in Generations. Now, one thing I noticed with Generations, First Contact, Insurrection, and Nemesis, all of them had strong data B stories. In Generations, he's trying to fix the array, but his new emotions are getting in the way. And then in First Contact, he's being seduced by the Borg Queen, do her bidding. In Insurrection, he's hanging around with this child who's from this race called the Baku, and they've got this little palm animal thing, and they're dealing with him identifying with his child, and him telling Data he has to learn how to have fun, and his programming went bad, and he went on that scout ship and away from the planet or whatever. And then in Nemesis, he meets one of his brothers and dies. So they're all kind of data themed if you think about it. And I think that the emotion.
He's such a popular character. I mean, everybody loves him.
So they made the movies very data themed. But one of the things about the emotion chip, I was wondering if they install that. Now they installed it in Generations. He's just enamored with emotion. And in First Contact, he can literally switch it on and off, it seems. Because in the next three movies, he's not really dealing with emotions that much. It's an on and off kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, I don't know if I like that approach. I wonder why they didn't really let that emotion chip evolve into something different. Data obviously wanted to integrate that into his life, but what if it integrated into his neural net and adapted new neural nets, new heuristics, and became this whole other thing that just brought him to the sentient point? If the emotion chip just adapted through his positronic brain and it essentially changed it, what if they'd gone that way with it rather than just be a static chip? What if it, like those nanites? The nanites were accidentally released by Wesley, and they came together and started to develop life form, or the exocom.
There's one thing, though. I mean, when they first introduced the emotion chip in that two-part episode on Next Generation, when that episode ended, he had said the chip was damaged when he had to shoot his brother, and the chip got damaged. So, following your idea, let's say that chip was put into Data, but because it was still in a damaged state, it didn't function to give him the emotions, but actually, like what you said, it expanded his neural net where it made him behave less android-like and more human-like, where, he could use contractions, where he can speak more fluently, or more easily. He doesn't sound like a computer trying to, give out a 10-pound answer to, to something. He interacts better with people, and stuff. And but the emotion part is not there. I know we're talking about Data here, but I have to mention Lore. And the reason I have to mention him is because maybe it was just the quality of Brent Spiner's acting, to be honest with you. Yeah. But even though he was obviously programmed, there were times where I had trouble mistaking Lore from a human Data. I mean, his reactions did not seem very programmed. And, maybe that made him scarier, that he seemed like he was aware of what he was doing and clandestine, and, I mean, I know that may have been programming, but I'm wondering if Lore, in a strange kind of way, was actually closer to sentience than Data. I mean, as odd as that sounds, I'm wondering... He was, but I don't think his programming was as equipped to be able to handle where he was.
Obviously, he wasn't stable
because everything he was twisted. So without having, I think because he said he was created before Data,
right?
So
and after before
he created Data, he corrected some of that problem, but he didn't get the chance to put the emotion chip in Data to see what would have happened. You know what I'm saying? Because Lore had it.
Because Dr. Sung had mentioned in the episode Brothers where Lore and Data and him all meet on this planet where he had gone to escape the crystalline entity, that Data was intended to have emotion chips, and he intended to fix Lore. And he got close to that idea. And I mean, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he had fixed Lore. If Lore would have developed sentience first, and if he in turn wouldn't have taught Data, and they would have developed a very different relationship. That didn't happen. But I'm wondering if that had been successful. If Lore had kind of turned from Data's evil twin into more like his caring mentor brother. If it had come that way. Or even better, if Laura hadn't stolen that emotion chip and made himself further unstable, and if Data had gotten it in season 4, and it didn't create Carnation instant feelings, if he had to learn how to understand it and adapt to it over the course of the series. I think the good thing about Data that it's one of those could have been is a gradual development of his abilities. Because in Generations, he got the emotion chip, and then after they install it, you see him grinning ear to ear and 10 forward. It's like, oh, instant emotion. Yeah. It would have been interesting to see
it kind of felt jumped the shark a little bit. When they gave him the emotion chip, I was thinking, now what's the point? The audience for years was always like looking to see if there was this little hint of emotion from Data without the chip, and now they kind of just say, okay, we'll just give him the chip, and we'll do this, and it just felt like we were cheated. I mean, I felt I was cheated basically by letting him have the emotion chip installed, and he all of a sudden he has simulated emotions or something like that as a program.
I do a lot of soul searching about that myself, but my 14-year-old mind watching Generations, of course you're wowed by the first Next Generation movie. You've been waiting for this forever. Yeah. But when I saw Data having emotions, I thought, you know what? Troy had already said not too long before that, if Data was to achieve his goal of becoming human, he wouldn't be a bad one. And I saw in Generations that the emotion chip didn't really change as much as I thought it would. It didn't make Data this human. It gave him a new challenge to overcome. He didn't understand how to use emotions, and I think that's why he switched it on and off, because he realized he hadn't been set up quite enough to have that emotion chip put in. He thought he had reached an impasse where he could have used it because he pushed pressure into that water, but maybe he wasn't quite as ready as he thought because he couldn't handle them in Generations. His reaction was still rather innocent and childlike about a lot of them. And in the other episodes, essentially, and this is kind of a little joke I have, Data uses the emotion chip just to say nice catchphrases. Okay, so I'll turn off my emotion chip, but I'll turn it on and say saddle up, lock, and load. Yeah. It seemed like the emotion chip became a catchphrase device after that. Like, I'll just turn it on to say something quotable. This is my little joke, but, I think the Data realized that, because humans can't turn them on and off. They come and they go. And, I know in my recent life I've encountered that in an enormous way, I'll tell you. And, with Data, everything, he could kind of control it, Like you said, he had an on-off button, for his life, and with his emotion chip, he had the ability to turn it on and off as well. But to be perfectly honest, as Pulaski might say, humans don't have an on and off switch. So what if, like you said, that emotion chip had developed from that malfunction when it was damaged by lore, that experience, if it had developed in his mind in a way where Data couldn't just turn it on and off, when his reactions were less android-like, and he just had to deal with emotions being there. That would have been an interesting plot development.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand why they chose to do that in First Contact either, because I think, how long was it between Generations and First Contact in the Star Trek timeline? Was it, 2 years or a year or something like that?
Well, Generations was 94. Now, I haven't looked it up, but I believe First Contact was a summer movie, I recall. Wasn't it a summer movie?
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember now, as far as the Star Trek chronology goes, where it fits on the timeline. How long after Generations did they... was it 2 years or something? I think
in the Star Trek timeline. Okay, yeah, because they had the Enterprise E that obviously, I don't know if they were building it during Generations. I don't know if they were building the Sovereign class then, but I'd assume.
So I was thinking in that time period he might have learned a little more about how to control, deal with the emotions, and we could have seen that in First Contact instead of just seeing him shut the emotion chip off.
Yeah, and they did that in Insurrection too. It was almost like, well, we installed it in Generations, but it was a mistake, so we'll just have him kind of shut it on and off. I mean, I would have loved to have seen that emotion chip in Nemesis. That would have been interesting to see that. But, that actually would have been a great framework for a movie, just do a full-out Data and putting him in emotional situations on some kind of mission where he had to deal with it. Or maybe even, like I said, have Nemesis be that EMH movie. Like Star Trek, Revenge of the Holograms. That's a terrible name, but I mean, they could do something like
Yeah.
that, basically. Just, just do an EMH story,
Yeah.
and have Data be their leader and have his newly forming and developing emotions be the catalyst for his reaction to them.
Yeah.
So, we've explored a number of ways that Data could have become sentient in kind of abstract ways. Do you think the way Star Trek was going, there were any concrete kind of ways where Data could have developed sentience the way he was going?
I was reading it as if, I would say if they did Star Trek, 100 years into the future, like, let's say the 25th century, would starships become so sophisticated that they would be like where Data is? Would they be almost sentient in thinking, or would they have personalities or something like that,
You mean kind of like Andromeda?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, because you remember how the Enterprise was introduced in the first episode. The computer had more of a pleasant sounding voice. It wasn't Majel Barrett's sort of
Robotic.
A robotic kind of response. It actually had sort of an emotion with the emotional tone of the thing. And they dropped that in later episodes, and I was like, they shouldn't have done that, because that kind of in itself showed just how advanced the computer had got.
Yeah, this is not canon. This is a book I saw, and I get it. I don't know why, because it was a very odd book. It was a Star Trek book called 20th Century Computers and How They Work. And what it was Star Trek characters being written by somebody discussing the history of computers of the 1990s. It was the oddest book, and it was really good because it had some Star Trek humor in it. And they had Roxana Troy talking about things like RAM and stuff like that, and she was saying that, I don't know how people in the 20th century were able to get anything done while using computers. She said, Betazoid computers, all you have to do is think command, and it's done. And I'm thinking, I'm glad this isn't canon. I mean, my goodness, if Betazoid computers could think command, they'd be way more advanced than Starfleet would be at that time. They have interactive computers. You just think something. I mean, that would be terrible for humans with the way we think. I mean, you could have door slamming, and you could have ships pieces falling off the ship. People would have to become more like androids to function on a ship. Where if you think, or they'd have to build this really sophisticated system. So I thought, my goodness, they think commands on Betazoid, and the Federation were informed about this. It was a non-canon book, but they always said, the non-canon books weren't supposed to go that went way out.
Yeah.
But, it was in a book, and the weird thing is, it was supposed to be a tech manual sort of thing. And they put out this random quote that implied that, Beta Z is hiding this super sophisticated thought computer from humanity and not telling the Federation. And I'm thinking, whoa, why did you put that in there? That opened up a can of worms, didn't it? And that was during the Next Generation that, you can just think command on Betazoid and boom, your computers work for you. I think, no, I think the Federation would know about that. So it was an odd book. That whole book was odd. I mean, that's almost, somebody should do a thing on that 20th Century Computer book. It was truly odd. But it did, and there was a lot of data in it, because he was kind of comparing the inflexibility of 20th century computer neural nets to his sophisticated ones. So it basically dealt with, because I know if you remember in the 90s, there were all these contemporary scientists, throwing wet blankets on everybody, saying that we can't have warp drive, transportation is impossible, Star Trek is just fantasy. They had shows on PBS. You remember all that stuff. And this went along with that, although it got creative with it.
Yeah.
It got creative. It wasn't debunking, it was just comparing how the technologies evolve over time. Because, when I saw those shows, I said, this is what they said about air travel, what they said about the sound barrier, they always say that. You have your skeptics. And then, you have people who say, I'm tired of the laws of physics. Let's do something different. And, and one thing of note, just about Data's development, when you see the first episode about lore, Data lore, everybody's talking about Noonien Sung's theory about the positronic brain as being his downfall, that he's looking to old science fiction for an idea, and why would he be doing that? And then it turns out that Data and lore have one. And the whole idea of it is that Sung somehow found a way, and obviously his very brilliant mind, to make something that was once science fiction into science fact. So if he could do that with Data, maybe Maddox could have taken the next step and adapted that positronic brain or something. You know, there were probably a number of possibilities where Data could have become sentient. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? I mean, that incident in Masks where that alien archive affected his brain, that could have tripped something off. Yeah. You know, there were a lot of missed opportunities. Oh, Data has this emotional situation. Or even that Western, remember, where Data all of a sudden is talking like a cowboy?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, all of these things could have affected Data in ways that he didn't realize, and it could have developed, you know, new neural nets. Data dreaming, abstracting. Yeah. That's sentient. Abstraction is a sentient, you know, phenomenon. Some of that stuff he was dreaming about, you know, aliens were influencing it, but it wasn't necessarily pre-programmed. A lot of it had this very broad subtext. So, you know, you never know. Maybe just over time he would have developed the capacity without the emotion to feel those things or to experience feeling or a sentient process rather than, you know, programmed responses.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a number of possibilities. Is there anything else you could think of that's been on your mind about how Data could interact with people in a sentient way or interact with the world and the universe around him?
I can't think of any better way than just being around children. I mean,
well, he had to ship with all those kids on it.
Are the most emotional, you know, of humans, you know, because like Data, they're learning how to use their emotions in the same.
Exactly.
So Data could learn a lot just by, you know, hanging around with kids and, you know, learning from them and vice versa. You know, I think, you know, there was a lot of times where, you know, Data could have done that, you know, with some of the kids they had on the ship and stuff, but they didn't really focus too much on it.
And I think, another one of those unseen things, like Troy went into the classroom later on and taught classes about painting or whatever. Data could have done conversations with children or something like that, and there could have been interactions with younger people. And I mean, he interacted with him sometimes, but maybe a little Wesley Crusher interaction wouldn't have been too bad either. You know, learning about teen emotion, stuff like that. You know, understanding development.
They did a lot in that episode, Hero Worship.
Yes, that was actually not bad with that at all. That actually did where that little boy basically to avoid trauma wanted to emulate Data.
Yeah.
And Data had to kind of not just become a parent like with Lal, he had to kind of deal with a psychologically troubled human child.
Yeah.
And, you know, even though, you know, there were algorithms that were there to help him along, he had to sometimes leap a little bit beyond all that and kind of just use his own understandings and his abilities to show him that, well, you know, you want to be an android, but I want to be you.
Yeah.
You know, so that was actually, I'm glad you mentioned Hero Worship. That actually was a good example of that. And, you know, even though the Enterprise crew helped out too, you know, in the end, Data did actually kind of bring that boy, Timothy was his name, to a place where he was more settled with what happened. You know, even though they all helped him.
That was a good way to flesh out Data a little more.
And that would have been good to have more often, things like that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like I said, interacting with children like that in a way was good for Data to understand himself. You know, especially seeing a child who wanted to be what he was already.
Yeah.
To avoid feeling. And he was like, I would basically rather have to experience, you know, how did he put it? He said, they were eating, and he said, I would rather experience a tragedy or a difficult moment if only I could taste my dessert.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like I said, he's saying he's willing as an android who Data said, Wesley said once that chronologically he was only a little older than him. So I would say that Data would be the equivalent of a 27, 28-year-old human in age, just chronologically.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. But anyway, the point is that, so obviously as an android modeled after an adult who'd been around for 27 years, that's an adult as a human, you know, he could perceive the advantages of being human to being him. And, you know, he obviously had wishes. And you gotta wonder, could that be a prelude to sentience? I mean, I don't think it was all pre-programmed. I mean, could that be a prelude to something sentient? The idea that he dreamed and wished to be human.
Well,
Not just
it
I'm
could,
emulating my master, you know.
it could be, that, he probably took from what his creator probably wanted him to be and made that his dream to, satisfy his creator's wishes, maybe. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot
Right.
there,
So
you
if
know.
Data had that adaptable ability, could his ability
Yeah,
have not adapted over time to include elements of sentience?
yeah,
In Measure of a Man kind of dealt with that, but still, I mean, they kind of never developed it enough. They wanted to keep Data familiar, but what if they
yeah,
let him grow? I mean, on Voyager, even though she was human, they let Seven of Nine kind of grow.
yeah,
I mean, although she had a lot to grow too. She was a human being who had been raised by Borg, but she still had a lot to grow to. But you knew Seven of
uh-huh.
Nine would continue growing. She wouldn't remain that character. But with Data, they wanted to kind of keep him a certain way for some reason and never allowed him to grow. It's like he was always seeking humanity, but never reaching it.
Yeah.
Almost
So
like that was the whole point.
that was sort of the way Roddenberry had created that character. Was he
Like you said,
was
yeah. Never
basically
quite
yeah,
reached it.
that he was never to become actual human. He was just going to always strive for it.
The
You
journey.
know.
Yeah, the journey
Yeah.
of. But as you pointed out, Nemesis, because he realized that the human lives were more important than preserving his own, that
Yeah.
brought him a little closer to sentient thought.
Yeah. And I'm thinking back to TOS when they were what was it? There was the first season, and they went down on this planet, and I'm trying to think of his name now. It escapes me, but what are little girls made of? That was the name of the episode.
Yes, the androids they built in that spinny device. Yeah.
Yeah, and they supposedly was able to put their soul into the artificial body, but we
Right,
find out again that there's very little left of the soul in that body because at the end where Kirk says, "Look, if there's any human left in you, give me the phaser," and it just like he tried not to, but then all of a sudden he just kind of shut down and he just slowly handed him. So it's like you could see even in that where the process of trying to become human is almost not complete once you try to take technology and make it that way, which was sort of repeated a lot. Read even to the movies, like in the motion picture, where technologically you can't get into being a human unless you bridge a gap, or something.
Before we cut out on this, there's one episode of The Next Generation
Yeah.
that they did called Schizoid Man, where Data met this.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that he put his consciousness into Data before death, and Data, of course, was experiencing his thought. But you have to wonder. Here's the odd thing I always found about that episode: it just could have been his consciousness, and that would have been it. But he experienced all these emotions too. Okay, so what did that guy, Graves, I think was his name, put into his computer that allowed Data autonomously to experience his emotions and passions, instability and all? What did he do to make that happen?
Well, he was. I guess didn't he say something that he thought soon everything he knew about
right.
artificial.
So maybe he surpassed some. I don't know.
Yeah. So maybe what he had done by putting himself inside Data as it were, I guess you could see that there were problems that maybe he couldn't control himself or something, or he was unable to control the abilities of Data or something like that. That there was problems in that.
Right.
His show was about how. You can't superimpose your life over someone else's,
Well, that was
even though
the theme,
you
yeah.
see it as being lesser than you.
One of the things that he said there, he was talking to that woman who was living with him, and he did admit it. He said, "I'm surprised how much of myself and my emotions I retain." So maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't realize it, but still, even without that character being present, his emotions, this Graves' emotions, were able to autonomously just appear through Data. So obviously, even without the emotion chip, Data had the ability to conceive of emotions through other means. So, you gotta wonder if when he left his body, it would have been interesting if some of that had gotten left behind. Some of that emotional sense, not all of it, but some of that emotional sense that had gotten left behind, and it just developed in Data over time, like almost like a worm. Maybe he perceived it like a malfunction at first, but it actually wouldn't be. You know,
Yeah.
another possibility. Just, you know, there are all these possibilities where Data could have this experience of sentient thought and feeling and experience.
Yeah.
So is there
But
anything? What?
it would have been like without, you know, it would have worked with someone else's sentience in him. But, you know, I guess Data's own sentience was still too weak to be able to, you know, dominate over the doctor's what he had done, you know, basically.
Yeah.
So it still leaves the possibility that there was something sentient there, maybe, than Data, that it was still fighting to keep its identity.
Right. Or the ability to kind of receive it. Because when they were doing that test to see what was going on because Data was behaving oddly and they didn't know what had happened,
Yeah.
Troy described Data's personality as recessive in that case. So you have to wonder if Data's personality was not so much lacking in emotion, but just lacking in development. If perhaps, and Data said many times that neural nets, even in the beginning, were always replacing different ones. That there was adaptive circuitry, circuit, but I guess he did have circuitry. So, fair to mention. So circuitry, the ship didn't, but he did. You know, except for the detector circuit. He'll be running gag with us, I guess, for eternity. But anyway, the thing is that you know, with Data, if he had adaptation from the beginning, and he mentioned to, I think it was Troy once and Riker, that, you know, different neural nets could develop and be like memories. He could miss Tasha Yar. And, you know, what if those algorithms had developed into a system of neural nets, like the Enterprise creating a life form, and they had just developed beyond Android programming into something that was adaptable, like emotions, like a different type of sentience, like mechanically derived sentience. Those nanites seem to experience that. You know, you have to wonder, you know, and the Borg could have come from something like that. You know, a machine-human adaptation. You know, who knows? I mean, maybe it could have been, they could have put some, you know, human bioneural technology with Data that could have helped that. Who knows? They developed bioneural technology on Voyager, which was problematic. What if Data had been enhanced with bioneural systems that gave him more human-like responses too? I don't know. I mean, you get all these things to wonder. So is there any other thing you wanted to mention about Data and his journey to sentience and humanity?
No, I guess that's pretty much all I had to say.
All right. Well, I think we covered the subject really vividly, more than I ever thought we would. But it's a rabbit hole. There's a lot of things to mention about this. So until next time, I'm Andre, and this is Jeff, and live long and prosper.
Bye.